before. So the last step really is to put the tile back in its place. So I want to introduce a couple of things that I've done off screen. So the first one is I mixed up some thin set. I use Maypie. I personally like that better than some of the other thin set brands that I've tried. I'm not a big fan of the Home Depot brand. VersaBond, I just haven't had great success with it. The instructions I find tell you to mix it far too thick, so you end up with a really dry thin set. It hardens too quickly. It's not easy to work with. You end up with gaps. You end up with the air bubbles, and then ultimately the tiles can come back up again, lift back up again, which you really don't want. Ultimately, you want to have a nice, good seal here. The key here really is what thin set is to do. Its job is really to cushion. It's to connect your very hard tile, either ceramic or porcelain in my case, which is an extremely hard tile, to the underlying concrete, and ensure that it has connection over the entire surface. So what you want to try to do is avoid any high spots or low spots that are going to end up getting air in between. And so everything that we're doing here in preparing this space is attempting to get the air out from in between the tile and the concrete. So I'm going to show you a couple of the tools that I use, that I like to use. So first thing we need is I use a scooper. What's great about these scoopers, and this is an invaluable one, you can see I've used it many, many times, hundreds if not thousands of times. The value of it is, you'll notice there's a little curved edge on here. It fits the buckets, the 5-gallon buckets, almost perfectly when it comes to the radius of the bucket. So what that allows you to do is get a nice clean scrape off the bucket, keep your workspace really, really clean, and that's really key here when you're working with something as thick and as sticky as thin set is. You really just want to make sure everything stays clean, you don't get the thin set everywhere. The second thing I have is the appropriate size notch trowel. So you'll notice that these are really quite large notches. These are 1/2-inch notches, and that's because it's a large tile. What you want to do is look on your thin set packaging. It'll tell you what size trowel you should use for the right size tile that you're working with. There's probably 100 different kinds of thin set out there, so you want to find one that's most appropriate. The least expensive one is not necessarily the one that you want, and also the most expensive one, if you end up doing something that, if you end up buying something really expensive that you don't need, well, then you're just wasting your money. A couple of other things I have is I typically have at least one margin trowel. Margin trowel allows me to spread. And this one's a notched margin trowel. Again, it has a very small notch because I'm up against corners here, but also has a straight edge on it, at least one straight edge. And sometimes I'll just bring a joint knife just to help spread things around. You'll see in a little bit, it just gets kind of messy. So the other one is the technique that you're going to use to put the thin set down on concrete. So typically what you'll want to do is you'll want to get the concrete a little bit wet. And what that does is it just prevents the thin set from separating from the concrete if it doesn't get a good bond. So I have a little bit of water here. I'm going to go ahead and wet this a little bit right now. Doesn't need to be really wet, just a little bit of moisture. You don't want it to be too wet. While I'm doing this, I'm kind of scraping down some of the high spots in the old thin set that was there. It's just going to give us a nice good key into the concrete. So I also keep my water close by in case I need to clean my hands or my gloves. Just keeps me from getting thin set everywhere else that I'm working. So next thing we'll do, scoop some up. It's going to be somewhere about the consistency of creamy peanut butter. Some people like it a little bit thinner, depending on what your application is. You know, the manufacturer gives you specifications on water, but there's typically a range depending on how you're using it, right? So on something as simple as this, you kind of choose the middle of the range. You don't want something too stiff, because then it's simply not going to give you the nice bed of thin set that you want. I also know that in my particular case, because I looked at it and set the tile down in it, I noticed that there's a little bit lower here along the edge than it is across the back. Now I took that into account when I laid these other tiles next to it. But again, right when you test fit it, you'll notice, are there any high spots and low spots that you can see? You know, it's always good perhaps to take your trowel and set up the straight part of it, see if there's anything inside of there that you know, you can see some space in between. I notice that just as I'm in the last 2 or 3 inches here on the edge, it just turns down about 1/4 of an inch. And so in that case, I want to just make sure that my thin set is closer up here. So the technique you want to use is, and this is something that I learned from somebody, or I learned from watching other YouTube channels, as well as watching manufacturer specifications videos. So the American Tile Society, I believe, had a great video about how you want to comb your thin set. And typically what you want to do is you want to comb your thin set with the notch trowel in a way that you can squish the air out. Okay? If you comb from side to side or make a swirly, what that does is it creates air bubbles that get trapped in between. And so then you end up with a void behind the tile. So what you want to do is you want to scoop it out in there. So I'm just going to make a big chunk in the middle. Probably put a bit too much, a bit too aggressive there. And then I'm gonna comb it with my trowel. And the first key here is really just to get into the spot, into the right spot that I want it to be. So I'm not really worried too much about it, combing it the right direction at this point. That'll be just as I finish it. Right now I'm just really trying to focus on getting the thin set in the spot where I want it to be. And ensuring that it's going to be pretty consistent across the space. Seems like I got kind of lucky on this one, getting the right amount. Sometimes you'll need a little bit more, you'll need a little bit less. Don't be shy in taking your trowel, perhaps even your margin trowel, scooping some out, scrape it in on your bucket. Again, keep your tools as clean as you possibly can. And then, the last part of it, I'm going to make sure I get a nice comb pointed at a 45-degree angle with my trowel. And at this point now, I'm going to clean off my trowel just because I'm only doing one tile, right? Typically you're going to mix up a lot less thin set for just one tile like this. You're going to use just a small portion of it. You want to play around with the water content. So the other thing that I know is when I worked with this tile, I made a thin back buttering on it as well. And back buttering is just putting the thin set again on the back side of the tile as well as on the floor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this again, and I know from when I tiled it, I did this with my margin trowel. I'm going in the same direction with my comb on my tile as I did on my floor, right? Because this is the back edge that's going to go across the back there. And so going from back to front, and what that allows us to do is squeeze the air out towards the front. Where, you know, it's a bit of an art. Really good tile layers, they know their craft really well. They're going to know exactly how much thin set to put on what part of the tile. It's going to take a little bit of practice. Worst case, if you've done something wrong before the thin set dries, pull it back up, scrape it all off, and start all over again. There's nothing wrong with taking a little bit extra time, making sure you're doing it right the first time. So, now I've got them both buttered. Now I'm going to take my tile, I'm going to slide it towards the back. Again, I want the air bubbles to squish out towards the front. And as I lay this down, I'm going to then press from the back and towards the front of the tile. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to make sure, now I want to make sure that this beds properly. Make sure that I get this down to the same height as the tile that was laid before. This is where you're going to play with a little bit. I think I put a little bit more thin set on it this time than I did on the previous tiles. So I may take this back up, scrape a little bit off, just like I said, and then lay it back down again. What you're going to find is it's going to be a really tight bond. I'll show you how tight I'm talking. If you've done your tiling right, if you've combed your thin set correctly, this should be almost impossible to pull up, even in its current state. So I'll show you what I mean. That has really got a tight bond there. Again, I don't want to break the tile, but it's got a really nice tight bond to the concrete already. See how everything is just neatly, almost perfectly evenly spread throughout? That means I did a very good job. You can see some little spots over here that seem a little bit high, but what you want to see is consistently throughout the entire tile, nice connection between the base and the tile itself with the thin set. So at this point I'm going to kind of clean my stuff up off camera, and we're done. So now you know you can tile yourself, and trust me, if I can do it, you can do it too.